in doing so, it was committing an act of perfidy, right? It was adopting forbidden signs. It was using the medical personnel there and the patients there as human shields. So one of the charming things about the Goldstone Report is how it dealt with all these uncomfortable things. The Goldstone Report has a whole list of recommendations against Israel, about holding Israelis on trial before the International Criminal Court, placing them on trial in various courts in the world under a theory called universal jurisdiction. And it directed these primarily at Israel because that's all that the Goldstone Report thought was worth investigating. So if you take, for example, did the Hamas commit a crime of civilian shielding or perfidy in Shifa Hospital? Well, the Goldstone Report has a simple answer, which is it couldn't find any evidence to support the allegations by the Israeli government that Shifa is used as a military base. Now, why didn't it find any evidence? Well, you read in between it says the mission did not investigate the case of Al-Shifa Hospital. It didn't look, and therefore it didn't find. Now, isn't that convenient? All right, so most of you go through the report, and what you'll find is that it's based on an investigation, it says, of 36 particular incidents. Every single one of these incidents, by coincidence, involves a single party as the accused. Who's that accused party? Israel. Okay. Now, when it came to Israel, in accusing Israel, of course, it couldn't still wouldn't suffice simply accusing Israel in order to find it guilty, but it did for the Goldstone Report. So I guess JJ is going to be talking more about the laws of war in relation to this, but this is a fairly typical way that the Goldstone Report and others deal with it, right? You have, in the laws of war, one of the important things is what the parties intend. So, for example, it's a war crime to aim at civilians. It's not necessarily a war crime if a civilian gets killed. It's a war crime if you aimed at the civilians. Right? Now, what did the Goldstone Report say? Well, civilians died. Israel must have committed a war crime. Why? Because Israel has sophisticated technology, and therefore no errors occurred. If a civilian is dead, Israel must have aimed at him. Now, there's other charming bits to this report that I wish I had time to go into. You know, like there's this bit about pop psychology, for example, where they quote a Palestinian psychiatrist explaining that the Palestinian in the eyes of the Israeli soldier is not an equal human being, sometimes even becomes a demon. It's because of a state of paranoia. Right? This is the sort of in-depth psychological examination that the Goldstone Report included. But we'll have to leave it at that and move on to why is this important, right? Why is this document, the document number 2 million from the UN that condemns Israel, important to us? Well, the point of the document was to make sure that Israelis get put up on criminal charges around the world, and that's in fact what happens. Right? So here you have Tzipi Livni was threatened with arrest in South Africa, in the UK, on the basis of the alleged crimes that she performed that are proved by the Goldstone Report. Or here was Shimon Peres was in Switzerland a little over a month ago, I guess it was, where they sought to arrest him for crimes that were proved by the Goldstone Report. Now, does the Goldstone Report prove any crimes by Shimon Peres? Well, not really, but it's still good for harassment. Right? The Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, has described this as the Goldstone threat. It's part of a larger campaign in order to try to criminalize, in essence, the entire leadership of Israel. Any Israeli leader who goes abroad will end up in court. Even if they end up being acquitted in the end, it still makes it rather difficult to carry on diplomacy. It's also designed to support various actions to impose diplomatic and economic sanctions on Israel. It is a real threat. Now, about a month ago, Richard Goldstone published this sort of mealy-mouthed retraction. He said, well, if I'd known then what I knew now, the Goldstone Report would have been a different document. And maybe Israel didn't actually aim at civilians, as we alleged over the course of 575 pages in the original report. Now, this isn't entirely, I think, honest when it says this is on the basis of new evidence, if he knew then what he knew now. If you go through the report, and unfortunately I don't have the time to do so, you'll see that it's quite clear that if the report had been based on the evidence in front of the committee at the time, it would have come up with very different conclusions as well. It should have come up then with the conclusion that Hamas committed war crimes and Israel did not, but it didn't. So why is it that Goldstone changed his mind to the extent that he did? Well, I think it's basically because he was confronted and embarrassed. Now, some of these confrontations were not substantive, right? So Goldstone was apparently confronted by members of a synagogue in South Africa where his grandson was to have a bar mitzvah, and for the sake of the family, so it wouldn't be embarrassed, pulled out of it. And there's also Goldstone engaged in a number of debates in high-profile locations where he debated racist Zionists. That would be me and Peter Berkowitz in this case. And was confronted with various claims that perhaps the legal claims in his document were not accurate. The result was a partial retraction. Now, is that the end of it? Well, unfortunately, it's not the end of it. Right now, formally, it's not the end of it because the document still exists. The United Nations is not going to withdraw it. The UN Human Rights Council is not going to withdraw it. The other 3 members of the mission continue to stand by it. But more importantly, it's because this is not a game of law. It's a game of politics. Right? So the document is out there. It's meant to be used in order to delegitimize Israel and to harass its leaders. Whether it formally has been retracted or not is not the end of the picture. Right? It's out there. It's spread its lies. The damage is at least partially done. And while it's a good thing that we now have this half retraction from Goldstone, and it's worth pressing forward to try to get more from him, more of a retraction, we have to understand that this is not the end of the game. It's always, at the end, about politics. Which leads me to the very last item that I want to mention. This is really a promo for something that Rick is going to be talking about, which is the coming crisis in September. Right there, basically, as we understand it right now, we're promised by the Palestinian leadership. In September, the Palestinian leadership is going to declare yet again that there is a state of Palestine, and it's going to be looking for UN support for this declaration. Now, as a legal matter, it's fairly easy to resolve what's going on here, right? There's 4 ingredients, maybe 5, to being a state. You have to have a permanent population, a territory over which this claimant is the highest sovereign, a government that is the highest sovereign government in that territory, and the capacity to carry on international relations. Some would say that in addition to these 4 ingredients, the entity has to be recognized as a state. Well, the Palestinians have a problem with B and C over here. We can debate whether they have a good claim overall to being a state or not. They're already recognized by more than 100 states. If they win or lose a vote in the United Nations, and of course they will win it, it's not going to change in any way the legal picture here. But of course, the legal picture here is not what this is all about. This is about politics. Right? The legal claims are simply dressing for political arguments. Now, it's important to confront the legal claims with counter-legal claims in a way that will eventually, we hope, force people to retract in the way Goldstone did. But it's also important to understand that as the name of the game is politics, it's also about making people feel uncomfortable in their positions. That is, I think, ultimately what it is that led Goldstone to partially retract to the extent that he did. And I think that it's important to make people feel uncomfortable when they take the kinds of unjustifiable legal positions that we see the Goldstone mission of having done and that we're going to see shortly again in the future. Thank you.
Good evening. Well, while I'm waiting for the light, I want to emphasize something that Avi didn't really emphasize because he's a modest man. I think he played a really important role in getting Goldstone to recant his report. Because this debate that he was alluding to, where he was with Professor Berkowitz at Stanford, they had a strong exchange, and Avi is very good at debunking all the legal fallacies that you have in the Goldstone report. So it looks like Goldstone, with that debate and a number of others, finally got jolted out of his self-complacency and realized that maybe, oh, he was wrong after all. I know there are different theories about that. Some people say that, well, he knew all along that he was wrong. But it's kind of interesting that he came along. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on that. We can talk about that. Well deserved. I'm going to talk today, right now, about where is international humanitarian law headed. So you'll forgive me for reading. I usually don't, but I thought that given the place and occasion, it would be better if I had a prepared text. Before I do, though, I do want to do one thing, and that is thank Doris Montrose for organizing this fabulous meeting. Thank you so much. You're very lucky here in Los Angeles to have someone who organizes such fantastic evenings and lectures. All right. Whenever Israel defends itself from external or internal attacks by its Arab neighbors or by Palestinians, the world resonates with accusations of quote-unquote war crimes allegedly committed by the soldiers of the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF. It happened in 2006 during the Second Lebanon War, when Israel responded to one Hezbollah attack too many, and it happened again in 2008, 2009, during Operation Cast Lead, when Israel, after 10 years of putting up with close to 10,000 non-stop rocket attacks, finally decided to teach Hamas a lesson that it wouldn't forget. And it happened again last year after the famous flotilla incident, during which a large group of foreign activists tried to reach the perfectly legitimate and lawful blockade Israel imposes there to prevent gun running by sea to Hamas. The same accusation flies every time a pro-Palestinian speaker takes the floor, usually on campuses across the nation, but also in countless editorials written by Palestinians or some of their friends. But what does that exactly mean? Not much, really. All it has going for it is a nice ring. War crimes sounds dramatic and horrible enough to conjure all sorts of rather unpleasant pictures, pulled from our respective memories, be they real-life experience or simply movies. But all of it is an easy slogan. Slogans are one of the pro-Palestinians' favorite communication methods because they're catchy, they're easy to remember, easy to repeat, and you don't need a first-rate education level to repeat them mindlessly, even if you don't even understand what you're saying. Beyond the theatrics, though, what are we actually referring to when we hear the two words war crimes? In order to give you a clear answer, I need first to give a very quick historical overview of international law in relation to the notion of war crimes. In the good old days of antiquity and the Middle Ages, the mere notion of war crimes would have been laughed at. Victors had absolute rights over the vanquished. Brute force ruled. Entire populations were slaughtered with abandon. So what has changed? Well, one day the world community, meaning primarily Western nations and paradoxically enough, most of them colonial powers, decided that the old rules of finishing off casualties on the battlefield and forcibly appropriating the vanquished populations, their lands, and their goods were not quite civilized enough anymore, and some restraints had to be introduced in the way nations behaved. What could have been more enlightening than that?